AI-enabled threats, rising recovery expectations, and increasing cyber insurance scrutiny have fundamentally changed the backup conversation. What was once a technical service is now a strategic foundation for modern cyber resilience. Want to learn how leading MSPs are repositioning backup as the last line of defense? Then join MSP Chat co-host Erick Simpson and Kaseya's Brent Torres live on March 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar about elevating backup conversations out of the server room and into the boardroom. They'll explore how to connect recovery strategy to risk reduction, compliance alignment, and measurable business outcomes that matter to decision makers, and provide a practical framework to strengthen profitability, expand wallet share within existing accounts, and differentiate yourself from the competition. It's free, can't miss information, so register now by visiting https://bit.ly/backupdefensewebinar. That's https:// all one word, backup defense webinar. And 3, 2, 1, blast off. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the MSP Chat Podcast, your weekly visit with two talking heads talking with you about the services, strategies, and success tips you need to make it big in managed services. My name is Rich Freeman. I'm Chief Analyst at Channel Master, the organization responsible for this show. I am joined with you this week, virtually, unlike last week, by our CEO and Chief Strategist at Channel Master. His name is Erick Simpson. Erick, how you doing?
Doing great, Rich. Doing great. Looking forward to today's topic. It's very sobering, the story of the week, I gotta say.
Well, and there are multiple sobering dimensions to this, and let's just dive right in. You're eager to talk about it, and so am I. I'm actually going to take people through a few data points here. It's all leading up to something that we'll be talking about during the Spotlight interview segment with Robin Ody of Omdia. He runs MSP research over there. Omdia has recently published its 2026 MSP Trends and Predictions report. We're going to get into that with him at length, including a couple of stats that I'm going to preview here. But I kind of want to guide you towards those predictions that Omdia is making, using data from some recently published reports just within the last 2-3 weeks or so. And so I'm beginning with one from the National Cybersecurity Alliance. And obviously, I get a ton of security research reports every week. What's interesting and unusual about this one is it's based on data they've been collecting for 5 years, basically, 2021 to 2025. Not unusual at all to get a report that shows you year-over-year trends, but a 5-year trend I don't run into a lot. And so this was interesting data to me. They collected this data, have been collecting this data for 5 years from 25,000 adults. So this is consumer plus commercial data that we're talking about here. Over that period of time, awareness, basic security awareness of best practices is up. Erick, awareness of MFA, multi-factor authentication, up during the 5-year period of the survey from 52% in 2021 to 77% last year. And yet, regular use of MFA is down from a peak a few years ago of 94% to 53%. Way down. Awareness, very high. It's been going up for 5 years. And actual use of MFA, dropping. Installing software updates was 44% in 2021, down to 31% last year. And again, awareness, high. Sure, we should be doing this. Are people doing it? No, they are not. And surprise, surprise, one last statistic from the National Cybersecurity Alliance report, 44% of the adults in the survey were victimized by some cybercrime-related financial or data loss last year. That's a 10% year-over-year increase from 2024. So awareness is great of security best practices. Actual implementation of them is, for some reason or other, not explained by anybody, deteriorating. And no great surprise, that is resulting in escalating victimization rates among both consumers and commercial users. Okay, so there's that. Last week, I believe it was, I got a new white paper from Enable. It was actually written by the analyst at Futurum, but sponsored by Enable. It's called Cybersecurity in the Age of AI, Moving from Fragile to Resistant. We will include a link to that if you're interested in reading it. There's all sorts of interesting data in there. I want to call out one particular data point, though, which is they asked folks, and this is on the commercial side, they're asking people in the IT world, basically, what are your key hurdles to resolving security vulnerabilities and incidents? And two responses to that tied for first place. One of them was lack of skills. No great surprise. You either don't have the skills that you need in-house, or you can't find them on the labor market, basically. Tied with lack of skills, though, was alert fatigue. Too many alerts coming from too many sources. So what have we just learned from these two studies, Eric? Well, we learn first of all, security awareness training. You should absolutely be doing it. It is necessary, but not sufficient, because what we've just discovered is even as people are growing more and more aware, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So security awareness, not necessarily the answer to the security dangers out there. And I could have cited 15 different studies from the last month making clear that ransomware, there are some positive trends there in terms of the damages declining and people paying the ransom less often, but it's still a huge, huge problem out there. Security awareness training isn't going to fix that. More tech, more tools in the hands of MSPs and their customers, not going to fix the problem either, because alert fatigue is already a critical hurdle, one of the top hurdles in terms of actually dealing with security incidents and vulnerabilities. So this is where the Futurum folks kind of talk a little bit about, well, what can you do? One of the things they say is that as an IT provider, as an MSP, as a corporate IT department, you really need to be looking at being diligent about software updates, about patching to shrink the attack surface. I would add as well, one of the things we talk about in the context of security regularly on the show is this idea of platforms and platformization. It's a huge multi-year trend in the security world. To the degree that you're getting more of your tools from fewer vendors and they're more closely integrated, that might help you with the alert fatigue a little bit. But really, the two biggest recommendations that Futurum makes, and that clearly, based on what we're seeing and hearing here, are going to be the most effective, are automate the triage process through AI and automate the post-incident containment process through AI. And you can begin to understand why Enable sponsored this particular report. They have an NDR service, an AI SOC, essentially, their ad lumen unit. So this is absolutely what they have been preaching to MSPs for a while. You need to automate this stuff because you can't deal with it on your own otherwise. And that is what leads us, Eric, to a couple of the predictions that Omdia makes and that we will talk about with Robin Ody shortly. One of those is that managed detection and response spending will grow 13% this year, as we'll see talking about it. That's off a relatively small base. But again, you don't, as an MSP, want or need more tools, more alerts. You want to outsource some of that automated work and do it with a vendor that's going to be leaning heavily on AI. And then the other thing Omdia is predicting is that AI Service Desk and SOC, which is relevant here, will be the fastest growing areas for vendor-owned services in the MSP space. So a lot of reasons why MSPs and their customers need AI-powered security, automated security, and that dovetails pretty cleanly with a couple of the major predictions that Omdia is making in terms of where money is going to be spent and where the growth is going to be in 2026.
Yeah, Rich, I have a lot of notes. And I think this episode is especially relevant to MSPs in our audience that are really trying to become that next generation MSP, that modern MSP that sees kind of where the industry is going, where the threats are, where the opportunities are. Great job reporting some of those stats. A couple of things that really jumped out at me from the National Cybersecurity Alliance research were not only the 44% of victimization, that is the highest victimization um, over this 5-year period, but I have a couple of notes here. Let's see. Um, one thing that you didn't mention was 1/3 of the folks polled expect to lose money through a scam. Like like this is now an expectation. Like how crazy is that? Now, it's part of, it's like, it's a cost of doing business, it's a cost of being a consumer. How nutty is that? I thought that was pretty wild. So a couple of things that I pulled out too. You know, all of these, the biggest one is obviously this burnout, right? This fatigue that MSPs, IT professionals are experiencing and having to manage all of this noise. And I think your guidance and what we'll hear from Robin will double click on this is, we've got to stop relying on human beings to try to respond to these things. The automation, the automated detection, and response, MDR, outsourcing some of these services to third parties so MSPs can really become the strategic provider of guidance and road mapping and cybersecurity, VCAIO, like I always talk about. That is really now becoming the position that the MSP should hold, that trust with the client. And, I've said before in the past, Rich, if I were going to start another MSP or an MSSP today, I would outsource as much of that as possible, maintain the client relationship, be strategically valuable, help them, grow their business, achieve those business outcomes. But all this noise, that's what burns out and churns out technicians and engineers, these valuable professionals that we cannot replace. Let's see a couple other things. So the one big thing that I pulled out was security has, again, doubling down on what you said, has to be automated through policy and not left to users. So how can we automate? How can we enforce these policies? How can we put guardrails around what the users in these environments can do and cannot do? So a couple of thoughts. Cybercrime isn't rare anymore. It's becoming a routine experience for nearly half of internet users, right? So a third expect to lose money. It's impacting half of internet users. Let's see. Yeah. And what you said about automating the triage process, et cetera. I mean, all of these things have to be put in place now because this is what differentiates the market leaders in the channel from a MSP perspective, and the folks that are just kind of doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for different results. I mean, this is a moving target, and I know it's hard to lift and shift strategy and potentially take on more costs as an MSP initially while you adjust and transition, bring in more third party partners that can do some of the heavy lifting for you. But at the end of the day, Rich, a strategic plan is no good if it's not constantly being evaluated and adjusted to keep up with changing market conditions and threats.
Yeah, and in terms of you, pointing out that now is the time for people to be making these adjustments, investments, even if it does turn out to be painful for them. I'll just follow up on the first observation you made. Thank you for calling out that statistic about a third of the people in the National Cybersecurity Alliance study saying that they're pretty much expecting that they're going to lose money. And there is a kind, I said, when I was going through some of the other stats in that report, we can see awareness rising and actually implementing, using those best practices dropping. There is a kind of fatalism apparently out there right now where people are just assuming, why bother with this MFA stuff or the software? It's a pain in the neck and I'm just going to get victimized anyway. And that is maybe the best reason for MSPs to be stepping in with their clients in the business world to be protecting them from that kind of attitude. They can't control that attitude. They can control what they do to protect their clients from that attitude and the dangers it presents. And I think, Eric, I'm going to transition right now into your tip of the week because as we were discussing off the air before we started recording, you had a different tip in mind until you started reading this National Cybersecurity Alliance report, and now you've got one that's closely related to it.
Absolutely. Great pivot. So, yes, this hit me like, this morning as I was prepping for the podcast, I was like, holy cow. This is something we need to really focus the majority of our discussion on in this episode based upon this, because like I said, Rich, it's one of these opportunities that MSPs maybe uh, maybe not prioritizing as highly as they should, because there's a lot of noise going on, right? AI, cybersecurity. I've got, business challenges I'm dealing with. My team is overwhelmed. It's time to stop the show and take a 50,000 foot, perspective of where your organization is today, where it needs to be, not where you might want it to be, but where it needs to be to succeed and prosper in an environment where a lot more competition is already impacting his, historical MSPs, and the threat of these larger MSPs that are being rolled up that are already there with their AI and cybersecurity strategy. And there's a it's not too late, right? But we got to stop right now and take a look at what the tea leaves show and where we need to be in order to remain competitive, in order to maintain a high company equity value. Because again, a lot of MSPs are being acquired. Are you attractive to those? So there's two things. Are you moving to where the puck is going to be, right? And are you also building in the strategy that makes you attractive, during an acquisition conversation to command a high offer or not? So put a pin in those two things. And we're going to talk about, exactly how to address what we've just talked about, with these this new research. So we've got to stop relying on end user behavior to, as kind of the default. Like a lot of MSPs, heck, I did it too, Rich. I mean, hey, we're going to do some training and, great, we'll catch you at the next QBR. It's not enough now to just deliver these enhanced cybersecurity services that we feel are going to protect these users. The biggest threat vector is the users, candidly, right? So these are the folks that are out there clicking things when they shouldn't, and not trying to get around MFA and things like that. They don't want to do it because it's different, and I when I'm faced with enhanced or strengthened cybersecurity measures, I'm going to fight it, right? And my natural instinct is like, well, nobody wants to change. But the MSP's job is not only to deliver and deploy these solutions and services and user security awareness training, which it's even when that was another stat in the research, even though it's being delivered, smaller and smaller percentages of end users are actually going through it. So it's not enough for us as MSPs to say we've deployed these solutions. That's what we're doing. We now have to be very, very intelligent about where we spend our time to help enforce some of these things, and enforcing security defaults. Like, we have to be the watcher on the wall, Rich. We have to stand up and say, if not us, then there's no hope for our clients, right? So we have to require MFA, conditional access policies, and automated patching across all client environments. There is no get out of jail free card here. There's no hall pass for this. You have to be diligent about it. If you're not doing that, then you cannot, in good conscience, say you're representing your client's best interest. Yeah, I said it, right? You've got to stand up for what's right. And if your clients are being that difficult and that stubborn and won't move in the direction you need them to move in, then you're probably working with the wrong clients. So that's the other thing, right? Your ideal client profile has to be one where they see you as, like, if I go to the doctor and my doctor tells me, look, you've got to change your habits and behavior. He can't hold me accountable to that, right? But MSPs can. because we're the ones that can deploy these guardrails and manage these things. And, it's one of those things where the clients may not like it. They might not appreciate it, but I'll tell you what, when you can demonstrate that, you're allowing them to grow their business in a secure and safe manner, when other folks in their vertical market are getting hacked and pwned and ransomed, that's evidence there. Automating backup and recovery, not just the process, but the validation. This is one thing that when I had my MSP, Rich, we spent every morning, the technicians would be checking to make sure the backups ran. This was before we had a lot of automation and things, right, Rich? We were in the old days. We were like, making fire with wood and stuff, right? Flint and there wasn't even any steel, right? So anyway, but that takes a long time, but that's the only way to ensure that your last line of defense is actually capable of getting your clients out of a jam when something bad happens. That restore is the most important thing. I would say it's the most important thing that you can be doing right now for data. The most important thing you can be doing for end users is enforcing these policies and MFA and putting these guardrails in place, and then strictly enforcing end user security awareness training. I know it sounds like a lot of work, Rich, but at the end of the day, that's what is going to keep the clients and the MSPs out of trouble. Third thing is that, continual. So first one was enforcing security defaults. The second one was backups. And the third is ending with this security awareness training. It cannot be, when you have time to do it. It's kind of like we have to not only deploy the platforms and the tools, but I would say we have to show up. Like now we're doing a lot of hybrid and virtual work, right? So we'll send gift cards to get people to, get lunch brought into the conference room, and let's do a live session with these users, right? Get everybody to dial in from wherever they are. It's kind of a lunch and learn, and we are leading them with not only end user cybersecurity awareness training, but educating them. I would love to have an agenda. Every month we have a different topic that we continue to deliver to all of our clients so that we are maintaining that visibility and that reminder. And then hopefully with all the guardrails that we put into place and this training and keeping things top of mind, having a designated security champion in your client's environment that you can work with, that's how we kind of get our arms around this and manage it better.
Yeah. So, a number of thoughts about that. When you were kind of talking about not just doing the backup, but validating the ability to recover, it just reminded me that Veeam is going to be doing an event in May that I'll probably be attending. It's been a few years since I've been able to do that, but the last time I went to one of their shows, they published some data about the percentage of businesses as opposed to MSPs that actually make sure that they can recover from their backups. And it was shockingly low. So it's great if you're diligent about backup, but you were just kind of refreshing my memory about how bad businesses, IT departments, and I'm sure MSPs can be about actually validating the backups and making sure they're going to be usable and available to you when you need them in a dire situation. The other thing that you reminded me, I've had multiple conversations with Kyle Hansloven of Huntress over the years, where he has just railed, and he gets worked up about vendors in this regard, not MSPs, but it drives him nuts how many vendors out there don't make MFA mandatory. It should just be, you don't kind of negotiate this with your partners. You just build that into the tool and you make it mandatory, and everybody wins as a result. And it kind of goes to what you're talking, the spirit of what you're saying to the MSPs in our audience right now is, and we hear about MSPs who say, here are the minimum requirements that I have with my clients in terms of safety. And sometimes, I'm not sure how common this still is, but sometimes if the client refuses to go along with all that, the MSP will ask them to sign a waiver of some kind. And I think the spirit of what you're talking about, Eric, is don't let them off the hook. If you're going to be my client, because even if you sign a waiver, my life's going to be a nightmare when everything blows up on you. Forget the waiver. If you're going to be my client and you hire me because I am good at what I do, and I'm going to make you not only productive but secure, we must do these things. And if you won't do them, then, like you said, Eric, you're probably not the right client for me. And that the having it's not an easy thing. It's easier to say than do, but having the discipline to say, I don't want to get involved with this customer, given their resistance to these basic standards around MFA and backup and recovery and security awareness training. I think it's an important and a smart thing for the MSPs out there.
Yeah, I think waivers are more of a sales and marketing tool to get someone to go, wait a minute. Tell me what I'm signing here, right? At the end of the day, hey, I live in California. You're going to get sued, for any number of reasons, and you're going to get drug into court, even if you've done everything right. I've had partners I've worked with that this has happened to. It's like they spend thousands of dollars to defend themselves, and then, yeah, you're right, you did everything right because you had this waiver. But who wants that noise, right? At the end of the day, you want to work with folks that understand and take your advice and guidance. And yes, I know it's a struggle for MSPs maybe just starting out or have a large percentage of their clients that are just not strategic, but just work on that, and come up with a default level of cybersecurity enhancements, your minimum requirement that you require every one of your clients to say yes to. And I always say, ask forgiveness later. If you've got a segment of your clients, maybe they're just customers, right? C customers that just won't move, you can give them an ultimatum and say, hey, if you do not choose one of our, good, better, best bundles for enhanced cybersecurity by this date, we are automatically going to enroll you in our minimum required bundle, because that's just how it is. And then deal with the folks that complain about it afterwards. I mean, you have to, people don't want to change. And, if you don't stand for something, then you know what happens.
All right. Well, we have teased two of the predictions from Omdia's 2026 MSP Trends and Predictions report. Eric and I are going to take a quick break now, folks. When we come back, we're going to be joined by Robin Ody, who runs MSP research for Omdia. We will talk about both of those predictions that we kind of talked a little bit about already, but a whole bunch more. There's a lot going on in that report. Very interesting conversation coming your way after the break, so stick around. And welcome back to part two of this episode of the MSP Chat Podcast, our spotlight interview segment, where Eric and I are very pleased to be joined by Robin Ody of Omdia. He is the head of MSP research at that organization. He has joined us here to talk about Omdia's 2026 MSP Trends and Predictions report, which came out just a few weeks ago. We actually talked about it a little bit on this show a few weeks back, and now we get a chance to dive deep with the man himself most responsible for producing it. Robin, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, guys. Nice to be here.
So for folks in the audience who have not met you before or are maybe new to the name Omdia, they're going to know the organization you were previously associated with, but tell folks a little bit about yourself and about Omdia.
Yeah, so essentially I'm part of what was the Canalys organization before. So essentially we were Canalys for years, and then we were acquired by Omdia a couple of years ago, and then we've been folded into the Omdia research since then. I'm part of a kind of channels team of probably 25, 26 other analysts around the world who look at various different areas of channels research. Most of whom came in through the Canalys side of things, but some came in from the Omdia side of things, part of the wider Informa Tech Target company, I guess is the best way of putting it.
Okay. Well, you've been one of my go-tos on the MSP segment for a long, long time. So I appreciate you making some time for us here. So the obvious place maybe to begin the conversation in terms of data points in the Trends and Predictions report is you guys are predicting a 10% growth in managed services spending this year in a best case scenario. So up to 10%, as I think.
Yeah.
But which is a little bit lower than we've kind of historically seen there. And what kind of jumped out at me as well is Omdia is predicting like 10.2% growth in IT spending overall. So managed services spending growth is not going to be outpacing IT spending growth the way it has a lot in recent years. What kind of accounts for that? What kind of headwinds are going on here? And how different are those numbers?
Well, I suppose the obvious thing is the reason why we sort of mentioned the best case scenario angle is not something I've done in years previously. Is mostly because 2026 is obviously a very different year in terms of predictability. It's very hard to be absolutely certain based on the lack of kind of growth in end users, I suppose, under management by channel partners as a whole. So the way I would say it is we classify MSPs as companies that have more than 50% of revenue from managed services. But the vast majority of partners that deliver managed services in the channel aren't pure MSPs. They're hybrid partners, resellers, systems integrators, and all the rest. One of the difficult things is trying to get a handle on how much of the actual end customer budget this year is going to be taken up by things like increased costs in hardware, in DRAM, how much of the IT spend is actually going to be going through, is actually going to be taken up by hyperscalers, essentially spending on AI-based infrastructure. It's things like that where you're starting to look at, we have a very different kind of spending bubble going on at the moment. And so this year, in terms of where managed services is I think the number of partners that are going to be growing above that 10% rate is going to be smaller than in previous years. And where previously you may have expected more and more of the partners to actually be growing at or close to the kind of market rate, I think we're actually seeing a bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots, essentially. Those who have differentiated versus those who are struggling, essentially, to continue seeing that growth and who are struggling to adopt the kind of services that make them stickier compared to others. And we've seen a huge amount of churn in the customer base in MSPs in the last few years. And that is where I think some of the predictability for this year is very difficult. The geopolitical angle is obviously very difficult as well. Around the world, we are seeing significant difficulties from an end customer perspective in terms of budget planning for the next year, because people don't necessarily know where markets are going to be. They don't necessarily know where GDP is going. They don't necessarily know where the growth is coming from. And obviously there are conflicts and many political difficulties around the world. And that tends to have a bit of a halt on end customer budgets when it comes to certain areas, which is why I've used the best case scenario angle. There is a worst case scenario, which is essentially that the community is 5 or 6%, which I think would essentially be flat if you count in inflation in prices and acquisition related growth. I don't think we'll be there. But here's a caveat to it. When I ask partners at the beginning of the year in our polling, we always ask them how much they're expecting growth to be in their managed services at the beginning of the year and in the middle of the year. Usually responses at the beginning of the year are more bullish. I asked the partners the question this time around. Their expectations were about 12.3% growth overall. We typically tend to see that rate drop a couple of percent when we ask that same question in July, when they really know where their managed services growth is going to be, which is why I've put 10% as a best case scenario. But I hope we'll hit over that, but it's difficult to predict right now.
That makes a lot of sense, and especially this year being kind of an election year as well. So there's some uncertainty there, right, Robin?
Yeah, for sure. And when you consider the fact that, I mean, about 45% of the managed services revenue in the world is taken up by North America, its impact and its political space and where it is at any one point in time, that impact on the overall managed services growth expectation for the year is incredibly high. Yeah, and so I think it's really a year where we're seeing a lot of end customers wondering what they're going to be spending on. A lot of people prioritizing cash, prioritizing profitability, cost controls, and all the rest of it. We've seen that in vendors, in partners, and end customers. So it makes it a very difficult year to predict.
But it does sound like there are some macro trends, some secular trends going on there. That there's the localized conflict and uncertainty, and we've been dealing with that for the last year. And we'll come back to this because I definitely want to get into the haves and have-nots angle a little bit here, but it
Mm.
sounds like part of what you're talking about has to do with who is offering managed services and how they're doing it.
Yes, I think that there's a couple of things. We've obviously seen a few angles over the years in terms of the expectation and growth of partners who aren't MSPs and how they transition towards more of a managed services angle in their business. A lot of the difficulty that, let's say, a reseller has when it comes to transitioning to managed services has to do with things like changing sales incentive plans internally to drive managed services as a business versus selling licenses or selling hardware. The speed at which those partners transition also has a significant bearing on that. When you consider that about 12 to 13% of the channel community are pure MSPs, the vast majority of people delivering managed services aren't. And so how rapidly those partners transition to deliver next generation managed services, particularly in areas like cybersecurity or cybersecurity related. So I think about compliance. I think about anything to do with artificial intelligence, data management, data governance. Those are the things which are driving end customer conversations and end customer spend. And it's also the thing which helps differentiate one partner from another. Even in the pure MSP community, that is also something where we are seeing some people struggle to transition to some of those new services because they are relatively resource heavy and there are relatively few customers which are ready to spend at the levels which essentially create profitability for MSPs. And so the number of partners that can go after those customers is relatively low, which is why I think we're starting to see more of a difference between the haves and the have-nots. There's something else as well, which is something you guys talk about a lot. And you were speaking about it generously about me being kind of a go-to for you, but you guys are certainly a go-to for me too, which is that I think that your approach and your diligence in terms of understanding what's happening in the MSP and the vendor community sets you guys apart when it comes to a place where people go to get information. And so when I think of how those MSPs are transitioning their businesses to the next level, one of the things that we've all seen, I think, is an expectation in the ceiling of the per user per month pricing that we have seen in the MSP community over the last few years, where typically you would usually throw around numbers like, well, $130 per user per month is where you start hitting profitability, et cetera, et cetera. That was generally dependent on IT support around infrastructure and support around network. Is there certainly there is an argument to be said for North America, countries like North America, the UK, Australia, countries which are quite mature in terms of managed services delivery. Are we seeing a price or a ceiling for those kinds of services? And if you need to break beyond that point, you have to start delivering next gen services. That has been the case for the last few years, I think, and we've started to see that really play out. So that ceiling essentially is also one of the reasons why predicting growth is quite hard, because it's not like you can suddenly add a whole bunch of new users. And so if you can't add a whole bunch of new users, you either have to educate the end customer community as to taking on an MSP, or you have to somehow increase the price on those users and increase the services on those users that you are managing right now. So yeah, the maths is relatively simple, but not always easy to achieve.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into some of that in a minute here, but it's striking that the commoditization of some of these kind of table stakes services, the traditional MSPs are that's their bread and butter, that's what they're known for. There's such a gap between that and the race to the bottom as we keep adding more to our portfolio of services, and MSPs not really good at truing up and adjusting their pricing to maintain their margins. And then that gap between those next gen MSPs or the modern MSPs that are really differentiating themselves through the AI opportunity and the security pull through from that perspective, that really creates that gap. So I appreciate your perspective, Robin, on this. Less than 10% are really gonna hit beyond that 10% growth. It's these folks that are really leading the channel, or that their customers through this opportunity to govern and secure the AI and deliver those business outcomes like we talk about a lot on the show, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just how many how many end customers are there that are actually spending on these next gen services, that are aware of what the value of these next gen services really are? So a lot of the time, I think one of the difficulties I've had over the years is when I look at the usual advice is, well, sell more, manage cyber. Most people in the MSP community look at that and they go, okay, great, but to who? Because not all of my customers get it. Not all of my customers have the money to spend on managed cyber. Not all of them really understand what the value of that is or think that they need it. And so we've often been talking about, certainly over the last 4 years, the idea of educating end customers as to exactly what managed cyber does. Is it an insurance plan essentially? And
Mhm.
even there's a discussion, particularly in North America, around cyber insurers starting to take on managed services, and that being a massive competitive issue. But that question is still, well, where do people go to, and how do they understand the value of a managed cyber service? And that's just cyber, which has been around for decades. Now we start talking about AI, and we get into a whole other issue in terms of what end customers understand by AI, what is the value of it, and so on. So that's where you have to have MSPs that have the time and the opportunity to actually provide these advisory services to their customers. Not all of them have that. They don't have just spare hours floating around where they can start going to their customers and educating them around AI and cyber and compliance. And it's just, it's easier said than done, essentially.
Yeah, and that's a good pivot point to my next question. So it's, speaking about, managed security and things like that, you predicted 14.4% growth in managed security spending and 13% growth in MDR spending, both of which are way above that 10% growth in overall managed services spending. So how should MSPs interpret that, especially smaller ones, and react to these trends?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is I would love to take credit for those stats, but those are actually delivered by analysts in the Omdia organization, Matthew Ball, who's our chief analyst in cybersecurity ecosystems. So he's the one that's really in charge of the managed security stats, and is an absolute font of wisdom and data around that kind of thing. But also, as it pertains to the MSP community, MDR has obviously been one of the key areas where MSPs were able to go from, well, I can't become an MSSP, to, oh, well, maybe I can at least add more managed security through MDR. And the only reason they've been able to do that is because they've been able to lean on vendors and other MSSPs to actually deliver some of the critical detection and response capabilities. Now, one of the issues is when we look at AI as feature, is the way I would put it, which is AI as a feature or a product you already use. And in cybersecurity, AI has been a key part of cyber development, cyber products for many years, more than we've ever actually really been talking about. So the more that vendors, and when we say vendors, obviously for anyone who's looking for some definitions, we really mean companies like, for in the MSP space, for example, like SentinelOne, like Huntress, the people who manufacture the product. They are the ones that are developing these kind of AI capabilities. And if you look at any of the output from, as I say, Sophos or SentinelOne or Huntress or any of the other companies that are really kind of selling cybersecurity into this space, it is all about leverage us as a vendor for some of the key services, the mission critical stuff, and you as the MSP can be the front line. Without that, we would not have seen the growth in the MSP community of managed cyber capabilities, and certainly not of the next gen things like MDR and XDR, and managed SIM and so on. And the reason for that is, I think that but that still technically has a ceiling, because as much as AI is doing a lot, it is not pure AI. There are still people involved in security operations center that still have to deliver those things. And so in reality, I think if every one of the MSPs in those communities suddenly pivoted to delivering MDR overnight, those vendors would probably be swamped, I think. And I don't think they would be able to deliver it. At least not at the level of if essentially if every one of their customers suddenly had a breach tomorrow and every MSP had suddenly taken on those MDR, you wouldn't be able to manage it. So to some degree, there is a growth rate, but there is also, we need to accelerate the investment of what the technology can do as well. And that's where the investments made by those vendors into their AI capabilities are absolutely critical when it comes to filling the gap between what the MSPs can deliver and what the customers expect. And that is why I think the idea of cybersecurity managed services growth right now is still pretty strong, and our expectations should be quite strong. But actually, the number of partners that are really delivering MDR is not nearly as strong as we would expect, especially not when we have been speaking about it for so long. When we look at polling where we ask about partners if they're delivering MDR today, the majority of them are not, and that is it's another one of those moments where you realize that when we as observers in the MSP community, we often look at it through the lens of the MSP that does everything or can do everything, and actually most can't, but they are trying to develop these capabilities, but they very much depend on vendors and MSSPs to help them.
Yeah, that is actually a very clarifying answer in terms of the 14% in managed security and 13 in MDR. It's off of a smaller base, but there is still upside there. There's growth potential for MSPs who kind of get in on that right now. So speaking of AI and vendors and MSPs, you listen to the show. We thank you for that. So you know how obsessed Eric and I have been in recent months with all of you AI native startups for MSPs and the implication of their appearance for incumbent companies like ConnectWise and Kaseya and Enable, et cetera. One of the things that you folks say in the trends report is AI service desk and SOC will be the fastest growing areas for vendor-owned services in the MSP space, which raises the question. There's going to be a lot of growth in service desk automation, AI, SOC. Who's going to be capturing that growth most, do you think? Is it going to be the smaller, nimble companies who are born in the AI, if you will, or some of those incumbent companies that are getting into, or are, in the case of Enable and AI SOC, already there?
Well, I think in terms of capturing the growth, generally speaking, the smaller companies are the one that capture the most growth because they're the smaller companies. But the ones that are capturing the most mind share are obviously the ones that are the incumbents. And the reason why they tend to do that is because they already have the marketing engine to those MSPs. And so, but the thing is, MSPs have been building, let's not say AI for now, but automation around their basic services for a really long time. But whether they have been able to do that across all of the technologies they manage in such a way as to create, let's say, an RMM or a PSA product within which there are not just time savings, but potentially revenue generating capabilities. So what I mean by that is when we ask partners over the last few years about what they want to see in those technologies, which are obviously the basis for everything that they do, the modern MSP, what they always ask for is, well, what we want is recommendations. We want something that can tell us what our customer looks like, what we're not selling into, what we're missing, what the issues are, what the threats are to our own business from the customer not maintaining its compliance, where the gaps are, and so on. We have slowly been seeing vendors developing those things. It's not just about ticket triage and remediating low-level tickets like MFA complaints. This is about actually being able to look at your customer and being able to work out what you're missing in terms of what you're not selling into them, and also how you could potentially deliver a project in a more efficient manner to the way you've done it in the past. And realistically, because most of the MSPs use those, or certainly the big four, and we think about ConnectWise and Kaseya and NinjaOne and Enable as being the ones that capture the most market share, everything they do when it comes to automation and or AI has the biggest impact on the most amount of MSPs. The more that they invest in those kinds of either own capabilities or acquiring, as we saw with ConnectWise acquiring Zofik, that is just one of, I expect, probably many initiatives that are currently being developed. Now, what's really interesting is I was speaking to Lee Silverstone at Zofik probably for a couple of years now, even before they had really developed the product even. But they grew so fast and they spent so much time in the MSP community developing real automations for lots of MSPs. And there are other companies too that are doing this. And you mentioned this too, that there's an absolute hatful of these kinds of communities around trying to build automations around ticketing, ticket triage, ticket remediation, and on up the scale of issues that MSPs face. One of the things that is interesting is they were probably the first one I was expecting to be acquired. But I'll be honest, I did not expect ConnectWise to be acquiring them. I had expected it to be another company that would acquire them. But nonetheless, I am interested to see that the other companies that are doing this are not being acquired at quite the rate I would have expected. And so that's where I wonder if the MSP kind of focused vendors, the RMM PSA vendors, are looking at this and saying, well, should we build it ourselves or should we buy it? And they realize that the fastest way and the most important thing when it comes to this is data. You need a lot of data to build one of these tools. They already have access to a massive MSP community. Why not use them? Building it themselves is probably, they think, a faster and better aspect when it comes faster and better from a native aspect than it is to buy one and then shoehorn it into your current kind of model. Whereas ConnectWise looked at it, they went, well, actually, we think these guys are ahead of where we are, so let's bring them in and let's bring them, which they seem to be doing. Now, time will tell which angle is better, and maybe both will work just fine. But there are a lot of other companies that are doing this. The question is their access to MSPs. That's the thing. You can have access to 10, 20, 30 MSPs from a startup, but getting access to hundreds or thousands of MSPs is very hard to do. And that's why I think the existing incumbents are the ones that ultimately will prevail.
Yeah. I can't say I disagree with that, Robin. I think that, Rich and I have been talking about the value of data to the MSP themselves, of their customer base. But then when you take it that level higher to, their PSA vendor, let's say, that multiplier is immense. And this is, we've got to feed the monster, right, with data. So speaking about, this ideal of MSPs, trying to improve their efficiencies and bottom line profitability and things like that, you've got some reporting that indicates leading MSPs will report 15 to 25% improvements in technician productivity, which is huge in and of itself, and 40 to 70% reduction in ticket resolution times, which to me is even bigger than the 15 to 25% improvement. Yeah. So both of those are game changers for MSPs. So what specifically defines a leading MSP in this case? And what will they do to get those results? Is this something that they're doing in partnership with their upstream vendors? Is this something that they are, developing and delivering directly? We know MSPs that are doing that as well. Is it a combination of this? Is it automation tools? Is it AI? So let me just, fire hose you with that one.
Well, I think automation tools are obviously very important. Companies like Roost, who have grown very strongly over the last few years, helping MSPs with they're not the kind of company that like a small MSP would use, because they do some heavy lifting automation. Mm-hmm. But the reality, I think, is a lot of MSPs have built things themselves from the ground up. Now they're looking at that and going, well, can we use that in conjunction with existing AI capabilities in our existing vendors, or do we have to go to new vendors, and what do we do with that? When I say 40 to 70%, the reason why I have that number is because and why the range is so big is because it depends very much on the kind of ticket you're getting. Most MSPs get relatively low-level tickets, password resets. That's where most of it comes from. Mm-hmm. If you think about the idea that these are things that are technically automatable, if you can create a way for your ticket triage to be done more efficiently, which is easier said than done because not all tickets are labeled. The metadata in these things is not always equal, and they're often not labeled very well. if you can improve the process of actually classifying tickets in the first place, and that's where the difficulty comes in, right? Most MSPs don't have a legacy of tickets in the past that they can use to just shift over and throw into an AI tool. It's not how it works, but you can't just analyze all your old tickets and say like, oh, well, this is because you need something that can actually look at real language and create recommendations based on that, and then create potentially, essentially, work paths through that, and then to a potential remediation. And that's where the difficulty comes in. Is one of the things that companies like Zofik did pretty well was that they did manage to get those MSPs to provide old tickets, new tickets, even incomplete tickets, and start building recommendations for resolution and resiliation for resolution of these tickets, and that allowed people to see what the future could be for that. But the truth is that actually building a tool that does that is easier said than done. And so when the RMMPSA vendors are building these things, that's one of the issues that they are dealing with, is different kinds of metadata, different kinds of ticket data involved, and also different kinds of MSPs will resolve things in different ways. Now, if you are just resolving low-level tickets, you could hit potentially 70% automation relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If you are using a tool that can allow you to actually analyze that data and then provide you with the resolution needed. But if you are dealing with a lot of escalated tickets and difficulties, and this is particularly where the type of MSP is also very important. If you have people with experience, even at the level 1 kind of stage within the MSP, that can resolve a low-level ticket themselves, then you can automate quite a lot of what they're doing potentially, and that allows other MSPs that maybe have level 1s that escalate tickets a lot to see how they could improve the way they do things. And that's one of the difficulties, is no MSP tech team is the same. And therefore, if you have an MSP tech team that is pretty strong, pretty mature, understands how to actually handle low level tickets and how to standardize metadata across those, and has a process for training level 1 techs in handling tickets and classifying tickets, you're golden, right? That's where you can see the most automation available. But not everyone is like that, and that is why the 15 to 25% to me is that really comes from existing use cases and data I get from MSPs in terms of the amount of technicians' time they can automate, if we accept that a certain percentage of the technicians' time is being taken up by relatively low level tickets. When it comes to escalated tickets, that's where I think humans are still required. When it comes to major cybersecurity requirements, that's where humans can still be required. You can shut down a network relatively quickly based on an anomaly. That's not a problem. But it's then deciding, was that the right angle to take? Did the technology do the job that it was supposed to do? And what do we do in doing the forensics essentially afterwards to decide why it got shut down, what the issue was, and if somebody was able to access the network, how? That's where you need people people are still using network engineers to do this. And whilst that's fine, really you need cybersecurity focused engineers to do that.
I've got a follow-on thought just real quickly. What resonates with me about this last part of our conversation, Robin, is, in my experience working with, numerous MSPs in optimizing their service desk, the first thing that we have to do that takes the most time is identifying and classifying tickets. Like, we take what are the top 10 tickets the level 1 technicians get? What are the top 20?
Yeah.
And then, modifying the issue type, subtype, and item, and then categorizing. So every new ticket is categorized. And then we have the resolution process. It's amazing to me that potentially we can feed this data to the AI, and because that's what takes the longest in optimizing a service desk, is just getting that straight, and then identifying what should always go to level 1, what should never go to level 1 and needs to automatically go to level 2, and avoiding the escalation path. And then level 3 is, its own thing. So by feeding all of this data to the AI and saying, this is what we need, do it for us, classify it, that, like I said, could be weeks, could be months for a large MSP to do this. So that's a time saver in and of itself. I've never thought of it that way. And that could accelerate an MSP. And now I can connect the dots a little bit more clearly when you say 40 to 70% reduction in level 1 ticket load, because typically 90+% of all tickets are going to be level 1. If we can reduce it by 70%, and then the balance it makes a lot more sense to me now. So thank you for unpacking that for us.
Yeah, there's one thing that I always wonder is people talk about the ROI on adding AI into this kind of sort of ticket triage, ticket resolution thing. I mean, one of the main things that I have seen from MSPs that do this is actually employee retention. I mean, it's the amount of employee burnout that we've seen in MSPs is massive, and it's higher than anywhere else. And there are pretty good reasons for that. We don't need to get into all of them, but it's pretty tough stuff, right? Living in the MSP community, when you're tech focused, and even the sales and where they have the marketing focused people too are really struggling with this kind of thing. If you can help any of those roles automate some of the standard issues that they deal with, the amount of, it's not just about, oh, well, now we can redeploy this resource to something else. It's a human being you're talking about a person that is essentially struggling every day to deal with a workload. If you can retain those skills, as we know in the MSP community, skills is incredibly hard to retain. If you can retain them, then how is that not ROI? It's definitely one of those metrics where if you went from 25% churn to 8% of your MSP, of your employee base, and we've seen some MSPs hit 25 and in some cases more than that. If you can get back down to normal levels of organic, maybe people leaving or whatever, it's fine. If you can do that, that's a significant saving, not just in the fact that replacing those people is expensive, but also new people that come in don't necessarily understand the MSP, the culture, the way they do things, the client base, etc. That takes a lot of time to get those people up to speed. So I think to me that should be an ROI metric the more and more people use.
Company equity value metric, during M&A discussions, we want low churn. So
yes,
I love that being sort of a positive take on AI's impact too. It's not like coming for your job. It's actually going to make your job more sustainable and maybe more rewarding for you as well.
Yeah.
I want to come back to, you were kind of talking about the price ceiling out there right now for the MSPs who are not kind of getting into next generation services. In my conversation, and this is mostly in conversations with the CEOs of pretty big, sophisticated MSPs, but they are increasingly talking to customers who are basically, these are conversations not about next generation services, but about last generation services. The customers are saying, you guys are doing all sorts of amazing things with AI and service desk automation, and I'm paying you the same amount that I've always been paying you. Why aren't your rates coming down?
Yeah,
Reflect the fact that you've gotten way more efficient than you did before. So I guess my first question was going to be, are you hearing this too? It sounds like you are. I'm curious how that plays into the price ceiling, both for the more sophisticated MSPs who are delivering next generation services and the less sophisticated ones who aren't.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that the first thing is if the idea that AI is cheap is probably a first question that customers want to work out. You can automate things a lot. Now, as an MSP, if you have been able to show that your costs have been improved by automating things on a repeatable basis over more than just a year, then at that point, yes, potentially you could provide customers with price reductions if you needed to. Now, obviously, your incentive is actually to provide them with improved compliance services, for example. So that is to say, well, now what we've actually done is redeployed those resources, we've retrained them into new areas, and now what we're doing is we're offering improved services around compliance, VCIO, VGRC, governance, resilience, and compliance. If you look at those kinds of areas, then you can say as an MSP, well, actually, we could potentially increase overall spend from the customer, but by also increasing overall service delivery. The question around AI is also just, AI is not something that is cheap to maintain. And if a customer believes it is, then at some point you either have to have the discussion to show them how much it costs, or you have to have the discussion around, well, is that the right customer for you to keep? Because maybe they don't understand exactly what you're doing. I do think it's fair that but also if you said to the end customer, well, if you were able to, and all of the end customers are doing the same thing, if you're able to automate and increase your profitability year on year by automating, let's say you could just automate 20% of your costs down, which is not quite like that, but let's just pull a number out. And you said to your end customer, okay, now you probably wouldn't decrease your prices to your end customer if you were able to automate those things. Profitability is the holy grail in any kind of business area. End customers too are also trying to do the same thing, and so they're trying to chip away at their costs in their business, and so that's probably what the issue you're facing. But you have to be able to show some version of increased service capability based on the automation that you've done, and that is where, if you can show that as an MSP, then that's probably quite good. But I do think there is it stops you having that conversation, or at least when you have that conversation, it's a slightly easier conversation to have. But the difficulty for the MSP is that they have customers that see 1 minus 1 should now equal 0 for me, right? And that's fine. But you therefore, it's a sort of education in terms of, we were talking earlier about MSP end customers understanding the value of what an MSP actually does. If they understand that value, then they probably also understand what AI is actually doing and how that's improving the service capability for the end customer. If they don't, then you'll have an end customer that also thinks that, well, the value of what you do can be improved by AI. Yes, but probably hasn't yet been done over the course of several years. Automations have been in there for a couple of years, but that's not the same as kind of AI across the board. So I think what I find kind of interesting is customers don't necessarily understand the value of the MSP and what they deliver, particularly in some next-gen services, so they need education. Equally, they probably need education on exactly what AI is, how much it costs, and how hard it is to implement and maintain on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, that's a tough one. If MSPs have historically, been challenged at delivering, value commensurate with what they charge. And now we're always talking about moving the conversation from the server room to the boardroom, being more strategic, delivering business outcomes, that whole conversation, right? Yeah. But I want to talk a little bit about your prediction in M&A activity in the MSP channel. So yeah, the percentage of activity you indicate you're forecasting is 16%. Is that 16% increase in deal volume, increase in deal value? Is there some gray area in there? Do you have a stat for deal volume versus deal value? And more importantly, will that M&A activity hurt some MSPs? Which ones would that hurt most?
So it's a deal volume stat. The deal value is kind of how long is a piece of string, because you don't know how much people are going to pay for an MSP over a year, right? Mm-hmm. It's a deal volume stat, and it's actually based on numbers that are coming out of the private equity community, venture capital community, and some of the larger roll-up MSPs, and what they're predicting for how much they're going to be acquiring this year based on what we saw last year. So it's a deal volume stat. The deal value is, I think, is increased year on year, but is not as strong as perhaps we saw 3 years ago, where deal value is obviously, perhaps there were some higher prices and higher multiples there that might not be re-seen. But I find it very interesting because when we look at the MSPs that are most affected, well, actually, the ones that are kind of most affected by that, or the ones that are most acquired now, are some of the more mature and more attractive MSPs, the ones that do have, and of the raft of metrics that other MSPs and investors now use to classify the value of an MSP. If you are at the level where you are able to satisfy all of those metrics, and have had time to do so, you are already a pretty good way down the road in terms of maturity, because you have to understand what those metrics are, and then you also have to understand why they're valuable. Because as an MSP, some of those metrics, they're actually they're a little bit spurious. And what I mean by that is this: like in North America, where the vast majority of M&A activity occurs, and particularly funded M&A activity, which is a lot of M&A activity. The requirements tend to also focus, one of the obvious requirements tends to focus around annual recurring revenue and contract length and customer churn. And I think that's fine. The difficulty is that in some countries, customers don't really do multi-year contracts. If you're based in the US and you want to acquire, and let's say you're funding a big roll-up MSP, and they're expanding across Europe or Asia Pacific, which a number of them are, they may be expanding into countries where customers don't really do multi-year contracts for managed services. I mean, I take an obvious example is Germany, which is a massive economy and very big in terms of managed services. The vast majority of MSPs there are not interested in multi-year contracts, or even in some cases annual contracts. They much prefer month-to-month purchases. Now, that is a kind of an interesting anomaly, because if you require, therefore, if you have a blanket requirement for the value of an MSP, and all of those MSPs are just on month-to-month with their customers, then you might forego acquiring some very good mature MSPs. So you have to have a little bit of a flexibility, I think, in that model. But that's where I think M&A activity is always a bit difficult. The most mature ones right now, the ones that are most interesting, are obviously ones that have a legacy of delivering at least some managed security service and are already starting to automate a significant amount of their relatively low-lying ticket base. That is where most of the investment is going into. If you also have MSPs that have an advisory service on how AI is affecting lines of business within end customer, that is also one of the more interesting ones. What I mean by that is MSPs typically have not been very good at understanding what their end customer looks like from the technology that different departments use. So even if it's a small end customer, you have a person that does the finance in that end customer. You have a person that does some marketing, does some sales, and so on. Do you know what the different technology SaaS vendors in each of those areas is doing with AI to automate some of the jobs of those people? If you can do that, then you can actually start to advise what technologies they should be buying and how you could be managing them in lines of business. Now, that's not necessarily a vertical play. That's potentially a horizontal play. But if you do that, then it shows you are at the next level of understanding where your customer's going, where they're trying to save cost, what IT does to the customer's internal business, and how you can improve essentially efficiency within the end customer's business beyond just you managing their IT. I think that's the kind of thing where if you're in those conversations, you are a significantly more attractive MSP than somebody that is essentially still just delivering help desk and support, which is valuable, but not at the level it was maybe 6 years ago.
You know, one of the things that makes the M&A topic so relevant and interesting to Eric and me and a lot of folks in the audience is all of that M&A activity that's happened to date has created some pretty big MSPs that are continuing to get even bigger. And, you know, we've spoken in the not so distant past on the show here about this kind of flywheel effect where these bigger MSPs have more customers and therefore more data and therefore better AI, and they kind of keep pulling ahead. I mean, in that context or any other context that you prefer, I mean, what do you think about the longer term implications for the MSP space of the rise of these really very big MSP rollups?
Yeah, they're kind of the megas, like the really big ones, right? I mean, I suppose that the obvious answer is to say, well, the community consolidates, more business goes to the big ones, and so on. And I think that's definitely true. But technology doesn't get less complex year on year. And the likelihood of an end customer to suddenly become an IT specialist beyond the enterprise is also not increasing, because the technology is more and more complex, and so they don't have as much time to dedicate. The need of the MSP is always there. People will always need the MSP. The question is, if you were starting an MSP today, what kind of MSP would you start? Well, the obvious thing would be that you would start an MSP that has cyber managed service capability, but doesn't depend on that, because obviously that can also be a bit of a rod for your back. We've seen MSSPs go into significant transition over the last few years and have to start diversifying their services too. But you have to have managed security services capability. You have to have advisory services around compliance, around regulation. You have to have capability around AI management, particularly from the vertical requirement of each customer. You would probably want to verticalize in certain areas and have to decide which verticals are the ones that are spending the most in your country. You would also need to have some kind of understanding of how you improve the sales and marketing motion of the MSP too, and so on. And that's why the vast majority of MSPs that we see created today are, again, people that are leaving existing MSPs to create new ones. They're not people just coming out of university and starting an MSP. And that is because that's where most of the efficiencies can be seen. But the modern MSP is a hybrid MSP. There's someone they have some resale capability. They have some consulting, professional services, and advisory capability. They also have managed services, but they're able to focus themselves on just the customers that can afford to spend what they are looking for, just the customers in those countries and in those places that they believe fit their requirements from a vertical perspective or a sector perspective. And they're also just looking at making sure that they are understanding the things that will affect customers in those verticals, particularly new regulations and so on. And so if you look at that, the most obvious thing to say is there will always be a through path. If technology gets more complex, if regulation changes, there is always a through path for a new MSP that can deliver those next generation services. If there are still new MSPs coming through, therefore that means that you either have to say, well, yes, acquisitions continue, but is it consolidation, or are we actually ending up with still more MSPs in the market, but just different types? And what happens to those old MSPs that haven't been able to transition? Do they exit? Do they fail in some way or other? For the roll-ups, they start to get into a bit of an issue, because now they're starting to compete with big resellers and big SIs, and that becomes a red ocean in itself. And so you can get into a lot of competition there and still leave a lot of space for smaller MSPs coming through, dealing with those customers that aren't necessarily getting the kind of white glove service that they used to get. Yes, maybe they've got some automated IT capability, but there's always a backfill requirement for somebody who has next gen services on things that are always developing. And that's where cyber is something that always comes through. Cyber is always developing. It's the only area of the market that has a direct opponent. And so therefore, because of that, it never stops. It moves faster than actually anyone can ever predict. And so there will always be space for a specialist to come through and develop new capability. The difficulty is, if you have an existing MSP, how do you transition to those things without necessarily the allure of selling up? Because obviously that is also important. The final thing I'd say is M&A activity is very strong in certain countries. There are lots of countries where M&A activity is not nearly as strong. We have still a lot of headroom geographically for those MSPs that are centered in the US or the UK or Australia to acquire MSPs in other geographies around. That has not happened at nearly the rate that you would see in the channel partner communities in other instances. Resellers and systems integrators have typically been much better at acquiring cross-border than MSPs. Now, some MSPs do that quite well, and they're the familiar names to us all, but most of them don't. And so what we're seeing is in-market consolidation, but not consolidation globally. And that, I think, is something to consider, because there's a lot of development still to be done in managed services around the world that doesn't just focus on the places that we normally talk about.
Mm. So, Robin, sticking with the focus around these smaller MSPs for a second, your advice for that cohort is to invest in AI for internal efficiency gains before attempting to monetize it with customer-facing AI services, and avoid competing head-to-head directly with these PE-backed, consolidators in mid-market segments. Part of the allure of an MSP, Robin, is to, not only bring on a technology or add something to their stack that is, sell to the MSP, but they also want to be able to take something and sell through to their end customers, right, with these AI services. And hey, I've been a proponent of saying, figure out how you can deliver what you're learning internally with your MSP practice and deliver some of these AI forward services to your clients. I've been using the acronym VCAIO. If you can become the VCAIO for your customers, that could be a path forward. So talk a little bit about both pieces of that. Doing it first internally, reducing costs, becoming much more efficient, which obviously is a good first step, but then using AI as kind of a launching board for services to end customers, if you would.
Well, in the first instance, I think that if you're automating your internal business, yes, you do understand some of the issues that you can face. The difficulty is, of course, the MSP is not like the end customer. So selling what you've done internally to someone who has a completely different business model is not that easy. I think that I think they're actually two different things. I do think that doing it internally is good from a perspective of if you're abiding by certain compliance frameworks, then you have to, that is one area where you have something that's repeatably and comparably the same between what one business does and what another one does. So when you saw MSPs going through their own ISO certifications and so on, that was a good way for them to do something internally and then take it externally. AI can be a little bit different. Automating your business internally from an AI perspective, you have to take the things that are going to be comparable between your business and your end customer's business. And there aren't as many as people might think. So selling that thing to them is what you're really showing is, well, we did it here, and so we can do it more efficiently for you. I actually think that what you should probably do is separate the two, which is look at your end customers, your best end customers, the ones that really get what you do, and know their business inside and out and how you think AI can affect them or is affecting them. And you're probably already having that conversation anyway. Then transfer that to other customers that look like them.
Mm-hmm.
That is your fastest route. But I don't think internal AI to external AI necessarily always works for most MSPs. What I think is kind of interesting is if you then look at the kind of VCAIO part, that is where MSPs need to understand the different forms of AI when it comes to what their customers use. So split it up into different types. I generally split it into 3 types. You have AI as code, which is essentially building small or large language models that are private to your end customer, which is a very small subset of managed service providers who could do that or would do that. Then there is AI as feature. So AI in existing products your end customers are already using. That's where it comes down to what I was talking about, the line of business argument earlier, and understanding lines of business and what tools they're using and how AI changes them. And then your final one is looking at AI as product, which is people using actual generative AI products or third-party AI products in their own businesses. That's essentially looking at shadow AI and the security of using those tools. That takes you into other directions. And if you split all 3 of those up, you can then put that in front of your customer and say, well, how are you engaging with AI today in each of these 3 products, in each of these 3 buckets? If the MSP can say, well, we think you're dealing with AI as code, not at all, because you're not building your own, but maybe you could. You're dealing with AI as product over here because the products you use are currently got AI being embedded into them. We can help you understand that. Then you got essentially AI as AI as feature, and then you got AI as product in terms of the generative AI tools you're using or third-party tools you're using. How is that affecting your business today? Do you have a framework for how you should be using those tools, what data you should upload into those tools and not, what kind of education you're doing to your internal users about how they should use them? You got to split it up, I guess, into those kinds of things to make them understand it, kind of understand the simplicity of AI and how it affects their businesses every day. And then you can decide as an MSP which of those 3 areas you want to work in, which is most profitable, which is the lowest hanging fruit, which is the one for the next generation, and so on. But yeah, start with your existing best customers and analyze them, and then move to the ones that look a bit like them. That is probably is generally the better route I've seen MSPs take.
I like the way you broke that down into 3 segments: AI as code, AI as feature, AI as product, and kind of look at it from that perspective.
And it adds some real nuance to the conversation too, in terms of bringing AI into the customer, and as an MSP, you can kind of think about which of those should I, do I want to begin with as I maybe move on into the more ambitious areas. Robin, Eric and I could very happily take up another hour of your time talking about this stuff. This has been a blast for both of us, but we don't want to do that to you. So, for folks in the audience who want to maybe learn a little bit more about the MSP Trends and Predictions report from Omdia, get in touch with you, follow up on some of what they heard you said here. Where should they go?
Yeah, you can get in touch with me on LinkedIn, or you can send me an email at robin.ody@omdia.com. We have an exec summary for the MSP predictions report, and all the data's in there. Anyone want to get in touch with me, I'm happy to send that over.
Fantastic. Once again, Robin Ody from Omdia, thank you very much for joining us on the show. Folks, Eric and I are going to take a quick break here. When we come back on the other side, we're going to share some final thoughts about this very interesting conversation with Robin and trends and predictions that we've just discussed. We're going to have a little fun. We're going to wrap up the show. Stick around. We are going to be right back. And welcome back to part 3 of this episode of the MSP Chat podcast. And one last thank you to Robin Ody for taking some time out. Late in his day, he was coming to us from London. We wrapped that up at about 6 p.m. his time. So we thank him for joining us and having that very interesting conversation with us. So many things we could get into about this, Eric, but I think the thing that I kind of want to underscore is a lot of what we were talking there circled around. At one point, Robin was kind of talking about haves and have-nots, and this whole concept of sort of the next generation MSP and so on, that there's a price ceiling for the person whose business is built around the commoditized services. The next generation MSP is going to move beyond that into higher margin kind of opportunities. And it's a theme we've touched on the show through the weeks and months as well. But I think it's worth calling out. It's great to get some validation on that from Robin, and it's worth calling it out again. That the folks who don't see the importance of being the VCAIO and getting out of the server room and into the boardroom are really kind of setting themselves up for trouble in the future, either low growth, no growth, or an exit that's very disappointing, etc. I really do believe, and I've heard John Pagliuca, in fact, the CEO and president of Enable, in interviews with me and on stage, has kind of talked about the future is managed services. There are going to be haves and have-nots. I really do believe in that thesis, and I hope that the folks in our audience do as well, and understand that they need to be making the investments now to be sure that they're a have and not a have-not down the road.
Right. And just kind of tying some of that conversation back to our first part of the conversation today, when we're talking about technician burnout and just alert fatigue and things like that. The promise of AI, the research that he shared with us and kind of what his predictions are regarding the large percentage of level 1 tickets that can be resolved through AI, and 15 to 25% improvement in employee or technician productivity. I mean, all these things are moving that role for the technician and engineer in the right direction, right? Who wants to come in every single day, Rich, and close the same tickets over and over and over? It's like Groundhog Day, right? You want to be able to feel like you're doing something more than just deal with the same thing over and over. And if we can get AI to do a lot of that heavy lifting on tier 1 or level 1, then that means that we can spend more time training and scaling up our technicians and engineers to give them what they kind of signed up for in a technology role, right? When I, started my career, Rich, I wanted to, grow and learn new things and be involved in different, interesting and unique projects. And I, luckily had the opportunity to do just that. But I did start at level 1 and tier 1 in enterprise service desk. I mean, can you imagine if all I was doing for several years was just stuck there with no other opportunity? I would definitely, start feeling burnout and, want to explore maybe other things to do, because that's not really what I had in mind. I want to, excel and grow in my career and climb the ladder and things like that. And I think it's really important for MSP business owners to take that same, philosophy with their teams, is to build these succession plans and work and coach and lead each one of their technicians and all the employees to say, hey, here are the opportunities for you to grow within the organization. Here's what you got to do to achieve those things, and here's what the rewards are. Here's where we need you, right? But if you're stuck just, taking care of noise all day, it's kind of hard to focus on um, personal and professional business growth.
Yeah, and as I touched on briefly during the interview, I mean, this is also exposing a sort of ancillary benefit of leaning into AI. It's going to be great in terms of productivity and efficiency and profitability and keeping your customers safe. But to your point, it's also going to enable you to retain valuable employees by giving them an opportunity to grow and advance and do more interesting things, because that let the robots do the boring stuff, as Liongard used to say in their marketing. It's good philosophy. On the top, this leaves us with time for just one last thing, and it's actually going to be two last things this week, Eric. I've got a bonus for you that I think you're going to enjoy, so hang on to that thought. Let's go to what would otherwise just be the one last thing for this episode, and it's on the topic of AI. We are familiar with, in fact, you and I both know Corey Kirkendall, an MSP who is using voice AI to field help desk calls. There are other folks out there who are doing that successfully right now. So we are not actually discouraging anyone from doing that. We're simply pointing out here, before we get into this particular story, that there's a good way and a bad way, a right way and a wrong way to implement voice AI in help desk services. This story comes to us from my home state of Washington, where the Department of Licensing is using some AI voice technology to field calls from people who are calling about their driver's license or what have you. And we're all familiar with voicemail systems where right at the beginning of the call, you're given the opportunity to, press 1 for English and press 2 for Spanish. Somebody called in, pressed 2 for Spanish, got the AI voice system, didn't actually hear Spanish speaking. What it heard was an AI voice speaking in English with a, quote, strong Spanish accent, um, which, which is not what this particular caller needed, wanted, or expecting. It might have been a little training error there. So you want to test these systems. You want to make sure that they're actually working for you the way that you need them to.
If only we had a clip that we could play. And that, oh my goodness, what a miss. What a miss.
Well, I've got a bonus one last thing for you, Eric. You may or may not remember the one last thing on last week's show was a story about how at Uber they have this AI version of the CEO, and if you're going to be meeting with him, you can actually practice in advance using the AI, get a sense for the questions you might get asked. And you were saying, the MSPs can and should do this kind of thing someday. You're going into a big meeting with a customer. Wouldn't it be great if
Right.
you could use AI to practice in advance and find some questions that you might encounter and figure out how to deal with that, how to deal with objections? Well, I got yesterday, actually, I got a message on LinkedIn from a MSP chat listener named Tulsi Nareen. He is a senior sales engineer at ScalePad, and he wanted me to know that at ScalePad, they are doing something very similar to what you were talking about. This is not a prospect, something that could happen someday. I will quote a little bit from the message I got. We have implemented something similar at ScalePad, where all SDRs and account managers call into the AI and it critiques their sales pitch. The AI has the persona of various MSPs, buying profiles, etc. So ScalePad is doing sales pitches to MSPs, but it's basically the same exact idea you were suggesting to MSPs, that you could try your pitch out, figure out how to deal with some objections, get better at that, get a critique from the AI. This is actually happening in the real world, and I will bet ScalePad isn't the only company doing it. So anyone else out there who has experience with something like that, drop us a line.
Well, ScalePad, turn that around and productize it for your partners. help your MSPs have sales conversations with AIs that represent the personas of different folks in the decision-making chain at their prospects and existing clients. And challenge given.
All right. And with that challenge given, that is all the time we've got for you this week on MSP Chat. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be back in a week with another episode for you. Until then, I will remind you this is both a video and an audio podcast, which means that if you're listening to us right now, but you'd like to check us out on video, go to YouTube, look up MSP Chat. If you're watching us on YouTube, but you are into audio podcasts as well, go to Spotify, Google, Apple, wherever it is, get your audio podcasts. You're probably going to find us there too. And wherever you find us, please subscribe, rate, review. It really will help other people find and enjoy the show just like you do. This show is produced by the great Riley Simpson, part of the team with us here at Channel Mastered, where we work with vendors like ScalePad to help them grow and optimize their MSP channel. You can learn all about what we do at www.channelmastered.com. Channel Mastered has a sister organization called MSP Mastered. That is Eric, working one-on-one with MSPs to help them grow and optimize their business. You can learn more about that at www.mspmastered.com. So once again, thanks for joining us. We'll see you in a week. Until then, folks, please remember, you can't spell channel without MSP.